Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, today on an analysis segment, we're actually looking at a very interesting topic, which is environmental economics as well as climate action. Now, it's been very interesting to note that the Malaysian government has actually been calling on the private sector to view decarbonisation as an essential long-term corporate strategy to help boost not only economic growth, but at the same time as the nation shifts away from fossil fuels. The National Energy Transition Roadmap, or the NETR, now actually states the aim to derive 70% of Malaysia's energy supply from renewables by 2050, which is actually an upscaling from the previous goal of 40% by 2035. So, this plan identifies 10 projects which are actually aimed at achieving this goal, including the construction of renewable energy zones and creating demand for biomass. Niaga Spotlight today will be highlighting perspectives on how both big business as well as the average Malaysian can actually contribute to ensuring that decarbonisation occurs both on a corporate as well as a personal consumer level. To get an overview of environmental economics, first and foremost, a branch of economics that focuses on the relationship between economic activity and the environment, I had the pleasure of speaking with Associate Professor Dr. Santha Chenayah Ramu with the Department of Economics at Universiti Malaya. Let's watch. Dr. Santha, thank you so much for making time to join us on Niaga Spotlight. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for inviting me. It's indeed a pleasure.
Dr. Santha, so if we could get started off by me asking you about correlating environmental economics to the fact that Malaysia's FDI has definitely been growing steadily over the past decade. Recently, it increased to 926.3 billion ringgit at the end of the fourth quarter of 2023. Now, based on available studies, Dr. Santha, how does increasing levels of FDI into a country correlate with environmental performance?
This is a debate, right? This has been a debate, a long debate, I would say. FDI definitely contributes to development, economic development. Of course, there are many other studies that show that it leads to degradation and so on, but let's look at the positive side first. The first one, if you allow me, definitely it improves the environmental performance, right? Even though we are talking about investment, FDI, but it depends on where FDI is actually pumped in, right? So based on that, there's definitely a technology transfer. We can say technology transfer, capital infusion, adoption. If you want to adopt cleaner production processes, you definitely need FDI. So from that point of view, FDI definitely is contributing to the growth of an economy. But we have to agree that there are negative impacts on the environment. It cannot be denied, right? Some of it is overuse of the land, leading to environmental pollution, waste not managed properly, to name a few. So definitely, this is a long ongoing debate, right? Even from the theory of environmental Kuznets curve, if I were to talk about that, people wouldn't understand. Let me talk about it in the layman term. Definitely, in the early stages, you have to allow for development, right? And then eventually, like when you see countries really doing well today, like the developed countries, definitely now they are doing very well in terms of environment. They're able to balance. It's countries that the developing countries are still struggling to balance between growth, economic development, as well as to ensure or to minimize the environmental degradation.
Sure. So we're talking about also minimizing environmental degradation, right? So now, according to research both locally and abroad, Dr. Santha, it has also been found that the higher the FDI into a country, the higher the environmental degradation. And Malaysia in particular, this is connected to growth in the manufacturing sector. So what have been some of the major environmental costs of FDI to Malaysia? And perhaps what are some core approaches or policies that can help shape a more positive impact of FDIs into Malaysia?
Yeah, it depends on where this FDI is pumped into. So if you talk about industries like palm oil, right? If you think about palm oil or mining, right? Definitely leads to deforestation and habitat destruction in Malaysia. There are many studies that depending, so this is palm oil. But when you talk about manufacturing, right? If you talk about manufacturing, we have to talk about pollution, right? Air pollution, how water is polluted, all depends on how firms are actually dealing with this environment. Many of the firms, what they do is environmental cost is an additional cost for them, right? So they try to evade from this cost. So therefore leading to serious air as well as water pollution. When you talk about, there also FDI on tourism, right? If you talk about coastal development projects, then there are loss of coral reefs, marine life. So it depends on where it is pumped into. So if you ask me, the main would be pollution. How do we deal with this air as well as when water is polluted, right? And then overuse of land, when exploitation, because there are, if you ask in the case of Malaysia, we do not have a proper regulatory system. We have some system. If you ask me a proper regulatory system, or the transparency of the system, it's not clear. So therefore, definitely the impact on the economy is there, right? How do we deal with this climate change? Eventually, when you talk about air pollution, water pollution, all this will lead to the climate change, right? What's happening
Absolutely.
to yeah.
And if I may ask you over there, speaking of a proper regulatory framework, Dr. Santha, what would an ideal one look like? And also in line with, of course, Malaysia's broader NETR, the National Energy Transition Roadmap. So how do we integrate all of this and make it happen on a much more, I would say, escalated timeline, considering the fact that FDI continues flowing in? We're, of course, having a lot more development, but we do need to be able to deal with environmental degradation while it's happening rather than wait till the end cycle of the FDI to be seen through, right?
Mhm. Yeah, because they government are taking initiatives, but definitely when it comes to environment, the incentive base will not really. It works. I mean, like if you talk about taxation or subsidies or whatever, it does work. But then when it comes to how serious the environmental issues are, I would think that a command and control type of approaches. I talk about stringent environmental regulation and enforcement. That is needed, right? That would definitely bring towards the change. For example, let me talk about how do we stop or ban the usage of plastic bag, or how do you reduce the usage of plastic bag? We know that plastic bags can't be recycled. It takes hundreds of years for it to degrade or whatever. So those kind of issues, you need command and control. You need a regulatory framework. You need a complete ban. Like Europe, complete ban. There are some countries that have stated, like India, complete ban. They don't use plastic bags at all. You don't go for incentives. You say, oh, you try to reduce. No, it doesn't work in some of the environmental issues. You want to, if the issue is really serious, what you need is a proper regulatory framework, right? Where you need intervention of government, definitely. It has to come top down, actually.
So how can we actually ensure projects with potential high environmental impact are conducted transparently by the government and majority stakeholders, such as the developers, with the participation of the rakyat, outside of just having, perhaps stakeholder discussions? How can we ensure that the process, once it gets into the actual development of mega projects, is also transparent for environment?
Yeah, that's really tricky because you can't satisfy everyone. I mean, the one that I've participated is like FGD groups where they call everyone and we give our views. But my worry is whether our views are really taken into account, right? We want to know, after what happens after. Like they have this discussions, they have, they want to know what's our perception. We want to know what happens after that, right? Probably what can be done is to make it transparent what happens actually, how our views are actually taken into account and whether it's really incorporated, right? Because if not, there's no purpose, I feel, in the process, right?
Precisely. Thank you very much, Dr. Santha. It's been a very valuable insight to get a little bit of a
information about environmental economics and how it's actually working on the ground when it comes to actual projects and, of course, FDI investments. We'll go for a short break now. We'll be right back with Niaga Spotlight.
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. You're still with me, Tamina Kausji. We now shift the conversation to looking at environmental economics and climate action on a more individual level, with perspectives from Melissa Tan, climate action and sustainability advocate, joining me live in the studios. Melissa, how are you this morning?
Excellent. Super excited about this conversation, Tamina.
Fantastic. So, of course, I know a fair bit about the work that you do and the causes that you advocate for, but now let's look at it from a more wider perspective and boil it down to looking at hidden environmental costs of the green transition. So you have also been advocating for and living what we could call perhaps a zero carbon lifestyle for quite a while now. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Okay. I guess with the green transition, sometimes we might look at it a little bit too surface level, and that's where people start to approach this topic at first, which is, all it means is we're just going to switch everything to renewables, right?
Right.
But it's actually about changing up and transforming how we're running the economy and how we actually live at this moment. It's a cycle of overconsumption, overproduction, everything's done at speed. Instead of really valuing what is it that we need to shift, that isn't just about, hey, everything's just now on solar. So with the green transition, obviously, there is a lot of push for governments, communities, businesses, individuals to go low carbon or net zero.
Sure.
But that isn't just at consuming at the speed that you are at right now, wasting at the speed that you are at right now. It's just that now everything was powered by solar. Because there is a lot of pros and cons to the renewable sector as well. If you try and meet and match that demand of energy, just by replacing it, there is a cost of that investment to being able to provide that to the world as well. For example, with solar panels, you will have things like having to extract rare earth minerals, do a lot of mining for precious metals, to be able to build all those solar panels, to build and clear those football fields, to place all those solar panels. How would you change the grid and how it runs to be able to meet an ever-increasing demand? What about if we actually reduce demand, change the way we lived instead? Consumed in a way that met the welfare and well-being of everyone, and then have the renewable sector support that.
Right. So I love the fact, Melissa, that you really honed in on what is often quite contested, because when it comes to the transition, of course, we're going to be needing billions of dollars, USD we're speaking over here, globally, for this transition to happen at all. Not only about Malaysia particularly, but I really want to hone in on what you spoke about, looking at overconsumption and the hidden environmental costs. So when was it along in your journey that you became interested in reducing personal consumption, looking at just how one lives their life day to day? And how did that become kind of integral to you being a more green individual?
I suppose it comes from first the love of nature, the love of all living beings, and then seeing your personal impact to the world around you. I think we all get introduced to the concept of environmentalism and acting in the favor of our planet through recycling. So when I first, as a kid, just actively recycling and believing that was the way forward, that was the way of being a responsible citizen, a responsible human being that is trying to create as much good and as little negative impact as possible. And then to find out later as an adult that recycling is more often than not just a veil, a sham, that is kind of subverting you away from what the real deal is, which is the way that we live right now is problematic. And recycling isn't going to solve that. So then driving to the root of the problem, what is it that has kind of twisted the way that we run our lives and run our worlds? And how can we then shift away from that? And then that's when, concepts like the circular economy, how do we how can we meet everyone's needs and the needs of the world and its ecosystems in a way where everyone can thrive and not have it be a zero-sum game.
Okay, so speaking about no zero-sum game and talking about a circular economy, let's delve a little deeper into that concept. We've seen the circular economy in particular really highlighted, and that happened pretty much around the time when the pandemic lockdowns began globally. Naturally, because of global lockdowns, we were emitting a lot fewer greenhouse gases. But at the same time, now that everything is pretty much open and back to so-called normal, everything has shot all the way back up, especially emissions. So let's talk about the circular economy. What is it in essence, Melissa?
There are a few pillars to it, and the renewable transition is a part of it, but it underpins these other three parts, which is to design out waste, to keep materials in use, and then to regenerate our lands. We cannot just look at renewables alone. And that's kind of like the push around the world as well. Because I think when it comes to measurable impact and things that are easy to measure, that's when we focus on net zero, on the carbon economy, on here's how much greenhouse gas I'm emitting, and then this is how I brought it down to zero. But we're forgetting all the other three parts. So I think the stat that I usually like to refer to is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is if you were just to look at greenhouse gas emissions, that actually takes care of only 55% of our current emissions.
Right, fair enough. Just a little bit above half.
Just a little bit above half. But the other 45% is actually all those three other factors. And with all the challenges of moving to renewables, which again, a lot of countries and councils and cities and companies have done a lot of progress in, there's still a lot of friction because now you're trying to move the system into a renewable one, but you cannot forget the other three factors because the values that drive those other three factors will be the ones that will reduce the demand of renewables in the first place. If you were to just go full force renewables, you're going to create a lot of knock-on effects that would not be pretty, and we don't want to create new problems by solving the current problems that we have, especially if we're going into it with the same mindset.
Exactly. So we'll go a little bit deeper into that in a while. But at the same time, if we could now focus on how stringent do you feel are Malaysia's current government regulations on environmental protection? Let's perhaps just focus on home state area, Selangor Klang Valley. Of course, we introduced recyclable plastic bags, for example, a couple of years ago. But at the same time, is this sufficient? What more could be done from a climate action perspective?
I guess that itself is a very tricky question already, especially when it comes to us knowing that laws and policies, the effectiveness of them, it highly depends on not whether they exist, but how they are implemented and then enforced.
And also whether or not I think we as individual citizens are receptive to it, whether it becomes part of our daily routine rather than becoming, let's say, a chore, right?
Yeah, because what we want to do is actually change the culture. If we try and put band-aids over big gaping wounds, that's really not going to cut it or not going to help us achieve our goals. For example, I think if I were to think about, for me as a citizen, getting excited about all these new policies that are coming into place and then watching them unfold in the way that they're implemented can be quite disappointing, but can also be very confusing for the general public. Because then people will say, oh, when it comes to acting in the interest of the environment and ourselves, it is something that you can do halfway or can say that you're doing but not actually do it.
Optional, not
It is
essential.
optional.
Yeah,
right.
Okay.
And that doesn't really reinforce the change that we want to see. So a couple of things that I can think about is how I was excited about mandatory waste segregation for households in Selangor and several other states. And then to not actually watch that, for me at least, it looks like it wasn't or was, or in bits and pieces enforced here and there. So again, that really doesn't reinforce the culture. Seeing things like polystyrene bans and then still seeing polystyrene all over the place, or seeing initiatives like no plastic straws with big stickers and big posters everywhere. But then
there you go.
right in front of it is all the straws. So this is very confusing for any citizen because then it just shows that, oh, this doesn't need to be taken seriously.
Or it's not 100% through and through sustainable or actually renewable. I love the fact that you gave an example of, plastic stickers and other materials that are non-recyclable immediately being used to advertise that, well, hey, we've got, paper straws. But also, for example, paper straws may even come wrapped up in certain plastics, which could actually be harmful to the health if you drink hot drinks through them, etc. Okay, so from there, moving on, let's have a look at the fact that when it comes to our personal consumer choices as well, we are definitely experiencing one of the hotter years on record now. Last year was also extremely warm. And at the same time, you see the fact that the monsoon will be either out of season or much, much heavier than usual. That usually leads us to far heavier energy consumption when it comes to just the household. For example, keeping your aircon on all the time. So what would be your argument in the face of very practical realities for the average person who might be like, yeah, well, of course I do care about the environment. I am concerned that it's so much hotter, but for personal comfort and other reasons, I am going to be using this aircon for 12, 13 hours a day.
It is definitely a vicious negative feedback loop. The hotter it gets, the more you're also contributing to the state of the climate crisis. I guess in that sense, you have to really look at the way, understand that it's actually not just about how much can I sacrifice, but how can I redesign the way I do things and the way I live so that it benefits me. So for example, it might not be about me turning off my air conditioning and going off the fan. It might be me if I was in a renting situation, for example. Me moving to a place where it is conducive for me to not even turn on the air conditioning. So for example, I live in a space where I'm able to use natural airflow, work ventilation, work in certain areas of the room so that I don't actually need to use the air conditioner. Also understanding that each of us have a responsibility and influence to impact the world around us. So our influence isn't just limited to our personal decisions, because our personal decisions in all the roles that we play have a ripple effect outwards into the world that can go lower carbon, and we're going to do it collectively. So each individual is in a family, and each individual is an employee somewhere or an employer somewhere where they can create change through all these practices, through noticing all these opportunities for us to reduce carbon, reduce waste, reduce consumption, reduce production, and then watch that kind of amplify just from all these little choices. So I think that's where I think I would really like to invite people to start noticing where they can create influence, and not just sitting back and saying, oh, I have no choice, I have to turn on my air conditioning. Well, that's completely fine. But if you do, why not start acting on all those opportunities? You might end up becoming net zero yourself. Yeah, look at perhaps other areas in your life that are negotiable rather than maybe one big chunk that is non-negotiable, right? Exactly. There's a lot of opportunity for us to do it. It's not just about kind of lifting our hands up and saying, oh, I can't do something about it. Exactly. So looking at the wider landscape of Malaysia as a country and moving into a different discussion area, right? We've got, of course, our National Energy Transition Roadmap, the NETR, which basically states that we've got net zero goals by 2050. So that's a little over 24, 25 years away, which honestly, it does after all fly by. But one core part that is lacking really would be bridging public awareness. So in your perspective and in the experiences that you've had over the past decade or so, where do you think would be the most crucial, perhaps, age group to have interventions? Or do you actually think interventions are possible and necessary across the life cycle? Oh, definitely everyone needs to be included in this process. I think there is a lot of burden on the youth and saying that they will solve the problem. Plus climate anxiety, right? Because you're so aware of everything that's been happening. Absolutely. But it does need change at every level, at every generation. So I think the most obvious one is obviously better climate education to help people draw the correlation, connection between the things that they do, the choices that they make every day, and how does that translate into how it impacts the world around them. And then you do that at every level. So putting in climate programs for school kids, for and kind of not reinventing the wheel on that as well, because there are a lot of really strong programs locally run by nonprofits, and as well as tapping into the global network and their climate programs, so that now every Malaysian citizen is an active, is a climate advocate, someone who's taking climate action.
Sure.
So you need to empower people with knowledge, and then to also create the environment for that knowledge to be practiced. So introducing it to them, then integrating it for them, reinforcing it for them, so that now each of us are creating a culture shift collectively, to be able to achieve and help the government and other and all the industries to support the supply with the demand, and have the demand also influence the supply.
And I think a very practical perhaps explanation for that could be the way in which, if you're making, say, more conscious decisions as a consumer when you're doing your weekly shopping trips for groceries and other essentials, if more of us make those conscious choices, that generally scales back and rolls back into the providers, the wholesalers, the retailers, recognizing it, right?
Absolutely. We can create a positive feedback loop, but it does need to have intentional choices behind it, and then to incentivize those choices as well.
Right. So speaking about intentional choices and incentivizing, Melissa, so I have to ask you about this though. When it comes to, of course, private individuals or even, smaller companies, etc., doing a lot, especially over the past 5 to 7 years, when it comes to climate action and trying to be as zero waste as possible. And then that's always perhaps outweighed almost one perspective, looking at the destructive ecological footprint of the elite folks in the world. I'm talking about private jets, which belong to, not just celebrities, but other singers, etc. But how do you actually reconcile yourself with continuing the baby steps or the daily steps that you are taking as an individual consumer?
I think when you continue to show up, you form a part of the culture. So even if you don't show up, that's one link in the chain that is broken.
Sure.
As you form the chain, that's when other people form the chain with you. So you have to you will see the effects that it brings into your life. For example, better mental health, better well-being overall, as well as the change that you impact around you. When you start seeing the links of the chain be built. Now we're seeing this culture shift even online. For example, celebrities,
they get called out
quite
a lot.
Yeah, which would have never happened before. But for that to have happened, it had several years of this momentum building up, of this awareness building up, of this shift building up. And then for us to continuously reinforce and then build that shift up, so that we will see that place where the wealthy don't also get away with it, and that they are a part of that conversation and a part of that change. Because in the end, they are icons, they are people that the general public looks up to, and what they do to set the tone matters a lot in how people follow through. Now we're seeing even more celebrities that are living environmental values, that are going vegan, that are going plant-based, that are using their platforms to build platforms for people to join them in the movement. So that number is already growing, and that can only happen when this continuous positive feedback loop happens.
Sure, exactly. It's not all bad out there, right? So speaking about the corporate side of things, right? On the flip side, there's a total of nearly 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, which were produced by 100 companies or entities in the US in 2020 alone. And this is according to latest research. So some of the top polluting companies also have facilities and communities that have, for example, historically faced environmental as well as health injustices. What more, in your perspective, can be done so that organization, especially corporate organizations, have more commitment towards climate action? Perhaps if you have any even local examples that you might be able to share.
The example that I usually like to share is Patagonia. So I would highly recommend anyone to read the founder's book. It really, really draws out like what does it mean to have a business where its purpose is for good, and how that business can make a lot of money. Because Patagonia really proves that when you are driven by your values, you know, you can build a billion-dollar company as well. They are not perfect, not by any means, but being guided by those values led them to, you know, achieve so much more in changing the business landscape and setting the example for other fashion brands to be able to really set higher standards for themselves, rather than looking at the market and saying, what can I get away with so I look as good as I can?
Fair.
So then it's really coming back to the root of why is this business here? How is it serving society other than just profit maximization?
Exactly. So when we're speaking about, you know, our profit maximization, let's also look at another sphere of overconsumption, which is definitely fast fashion. Tell me a little bit about your work in the arena of actually reversing that tide, or also contributing to genuine recycling of the overabundance, really, of waste that we create with our consumption of fast fashion.
So I think fast fashion is a really great example, similar to plastic, of what it means to not create a problem, preventing a problem before it happens, instead of trying to solve a problem which is really quite complicated to solve. For example, you brought up recycling. The global recycling rate for textiles is 1%.
1%.
It's
okay, so let's say
1%.
you've got 100 pieces of clothing here, just one of those is actually going to get properly recycled.
And what you will see
That's
is
staggering.
a lot of people resorting to recycling in order to kind of allay the guilt of all this consumption and waste that they're
Clear
creating.
out the closet, etc.
Exactly. But again, what we need is a culture and mindset shift instead of putting band-aids on gaping wounds. When you know the stat that is only 1%, because the technology itself isn't scalable at the moment. And with fiber being all mixed together in multiple different ways, it is really, really hard to recycle, you know, the majority of textiles that are produced out there.
Sure.
So what we need to do is look at the way that we consume, the way that we produce, and going back to the source. So that's where, you know, things like extended producer responsibility comes in, where countries now have to kind of set up their systems and introduce legislation so that companies themselves are responsible for the things that they put out, rather than putting it out there and then letting everyone else bear the brunt of it.
Nonetheless, it's actually better to be consuming less rather than trying to worry about whether everything is going to get recycled, because I do want everyone to remember that number.
Yes.
Only 1% of every 100 pieces of clothing actually gets recycled. All right,
And
that's just mind-blowing. Okay, Melissa, so moving into perhaps one last area of discussion before we close out, we also are definitely having one of the highest rates of per capita private vehicle ownership in the region. More than 40% of our nation's total energy consumption actually comes from transport.
Yeah.
So do you feel that the governmental push for EVs or electric vehicles is the way forward? Or perhaps should we also explore ways to develop beyond our current car centrism, looking more at public transport systems perhaps?
Absolutely. Everyone is facing the pressure of going carbon neutral. But we tend to forget that low carbon mobility is not synonymous with EVs. EV is only part of the puzzle of low carbon mobility. And again, when it comes to accessibility of EVs, you know, there's the price factor, there's the fact that we're still in the midst of building out our charging network, there's the charging times, there's the environmental costs of building out, of even producing EVs. All these factors have to be taken into consideration. So when we look at low carbon mobility, it should not be from one lens, which is economically juicy, especially for car manufacturers, but all those other factors, more pedestrian-friendly cities, more better connectivity, more trees so that people actually want to walk, more sidewalks,
Bicycle
bike
lanes,
friendly cities, better public transportation, etc., etc., etc. There are so many factors, and it does not have to stop at EV. In fact, it cannot stop at EV because this kind of blocks out the majority of Malaysians who are not able to afford EVs and would then exclude themselves from the climate conversation, from taking climate action itself, when they are already the ones that are creating the least carbon compared to everyone else.
Sure, fantastic. Yeah. Melissa, we really could go on, but that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Well, this has been Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. We'll, of course, be back again next Friday with more business analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.